in intentional logic. So please, when you're ready.
How much time is there?
1 hour.
1 hour. Okay. That's for discussion. Awesome. Awesome sauce. Okay, I'm gonna set a timer just because I like keeping myself kind of honest about things. I realized I didn't stop my stopwatch from yesterday and it was going for like 22 hours. It's pretty cool. Okay, so I guess we're just gonna like maybe more informal today. So please, like, I was thinking I was gonna present a bunch of things that I did in the last year. And I was thinking we're gonna stick to more like containment logic-y things today. Logics, I guess I should explain what that word means. Does anybody who knows about what a containment logic is? Okay, all right. So containment logics are topic-sensitive logics too, are logics where traditionally when in that logic I can prove something like this, the typical criterion has been that the atoms that appear in the consequent appear in the antecedent. You have different kind of takes on this, and I'm going to actually want to have slightly different criteria here. But the idea goes to William Perry, who wanted the conditional to have this sort of conceptual analysis thing. So the thing that he was really concerned with, just to give a little historical background, and maybe there's a slide on this, is thinking about things like, how do we get like all bachelors are unmarried? The idea here is that like we look at the concept of what it means to be a bachelor, and inside that we see that it's defined as unmarried man, and we look at that concept and we decompose it and we see that okay, like part of that concept is the concept of being. Right? It's a sort of analysis, like literally in the like sense of like analuo, like breaking apart the concept in the antecedent and finding the consequent in there. So one of the consequences of this is going to be that everything that this is about is already something that B is about. So this, like, there's a sort of topic sensitivity that's going on there. The topic of C must be contained in the topic of B. And so this was sort of introduced by William Perry, and lately, Franz Berdo, after an during an ERC project, took this stuff up and thought about this in that like kind of epistemic context. So he introduced, I'll go through this on the slides, but he introduced things like operators. I'm sorry, like where that are kind of conditionals in form. So like knowing that phi, or actually let's go to one that's even better. He'd added operators that like, if one imagines that phi, then one imagines that psi. So it's like an activity of imagination. If I close my eyes and I bring up a scenario in which phi is the case, it must be the case that psi also holds in that scenario. And there's clearly a kind of topic sensitivity to there. If I close my eyes and I start thinking about ponies, like I think I bring to mind like a pastoral field in the wilderness, and there's like horses racing over it, and I have this act of imagination, and like I look at what they're like. So I think I'm trying to imagine that there are horses running across this field. Well, part of that is that there is a horse running across it. Or maybe part of that is that horses exist. I mean, there's a lot of deduction that we can do in that context, but it's not necessarily part of what I'm imagining that 2 + 2 is equal to 4. It's not part of what I'm imagining that either 2 + 2 is equal to 4 or 2 + 2 is not equal to 4, right? Like this is a logical truth, but the topic of this was not sort of initiated by my imagining this field. Right? So when we want to have sort of epistemic or imaginative or doxastic operators, sometimes these cases seem to be very sensitive to the topic. and the topic of C in these cases has to be included in the topic of C. So there's now like kind of a new flurry of work on these logics in which we've got topic sensitivity. Part of like, oh, also, like, please tell me if what I'm saying isn't clear or if I'm not explaining something very well. Like, please like talk over me because this is, I always like it, but I think like we're more informal right now, so it's cool. So I'm going to cover material from 5 papers of mine from the last couple of years. And there's a sequence of these 4 papers on subject matter and intensional operators. Okay, yeah, good. So part of what motivated this whole thing is you have very frequently, especially with the Perry case, this very coarse requirement when we think about models, and I'll put this on. We have this course requirement, and actually when Richard Sylvan started considering Perry's work, he was very, very, very antagonistic to Perry's stuff because of this. But we have truth conditions like a world. I'm sorry, have you've seen like sort of world-based semantics, or have you seen like cryptic semantics, these sorts of things? Mm-hmm. So like if I read this as like phi is true at a world, like there's a bunch of different states, right? These things might be accessible from other ones. Like sometimes truth is different at one state than another, right? So when I write like a forcing relation, that means that phi is true at W. So typically for like Kip Fine's semantics for Perry's logic, you had a truth condition like this. That a conditional, like this analytic entailment is true at W, phi analytically entails C. If essentially what it breaks down to is for all W prime that you can probably prime such that W can see W prime and W prime makes true phi, also W prime makes true C. So you have this sort of strict implication thing. Every state that I can see that makes true phi makes true C. But then you also have something that essentially breaks down into the atoms of C are contained in the atoms of phi. We'll see the actual condition. Semantically, it's a little bit different, but it's not, it's in some sense like syntax in sheep's clothing, right? And there's I think, if your truth conditions for things just break down into syntactic properties of the conditional, of the language itself, I'm always a little bit uncomfortable about that. So, I mean, technically what this is that the topic of C is part of the topic of phi, but it just sort of collapses into the atomic. But this assumes a lot of things about the topic of conditions. So this is all fine and good when phi and C are just like conjunctions and negations, well maybe not negations, conjunctions and disjunctions in many quarters of negations. But when phi and C are conditionals themselves, or intensional conditionals, that sort of inclusion requirement, what does it mean for the topic of C to be a part of the topic of phi, I think is a lot more subtle than the sort of course machinery that's gone before allows us to treat. Make sense? So I'm going to cover things from all of these papers. A lot of the stuff that I'm talking about is going to be in this very heavily Perry style thing. So we'll be talking a lot about the Perry style stuff. So anytime I talk about this, I always feel obliged to have a couple of slides talking about topic neutrality. Because we're very, I grew up when I grew up. I first started studying logic, and this phrase that logic is topic neutral was thrown about quite a bit. People have heard this, logic is topic neutral. And a lot of times when you start talking about topic or subject matter in logic, people's ears immediately start perking up, like, well, there's something really problematic to topic, it's topic neutral. But I always feel like I need to put this caveat that there's a couple of different ways to kind of understand what that topic neutrality looks like. Like, we can view this as invariance under topics. The way that I reason about certain topics should be no different than I reason about any others of the topics. So if I'm reasoning, and I mean, there's already reasons to think that this might be right. I mean, if you're a mathematical intuitionist, like you might be fine using classical logic to reason about concreta, but reasoning about mathematical objects needs to be executed in a different fashion. But I mean, generally, I think that this is the more anodyne reading, is that I can reason about any domain and I should be able to use the same principles of reasoning in these cases. But that's a very different claim than the second one, the sort of liberal reading, that topic is not like a semantically significant feature. Like it's topic is not something that you can really represent with a model, or that you ever need to or should. And I think that when we think about how to model things like Franz Bertha's sort of imagination thing, well, I mean, I guess maybe I can ask you all, like, if I told you that every time you imagine that you're eating a salad, you are also imagining that either 2 + 2 is equal to 4, or it's not the case that 2 + 2 is equal to 4. I mean, would you feel convinced by this? Like, that imaginative activity has every instance of excluded middle as part of the imaginative activity. Does it seem plausible? You say it is. Yes. Like, I mean, this is a picture I can think about. This is like, here I am, here's me, it's me, and here I am, I'm imagining a little bubble, and I'm imagining me here, and I am dining on a salad. Here's my fork. It looks like an egg. There, I'm dining on a salad. This is my imagined activity, right? I mean, this essentially, this case makes true the fact that in this imaginative episode that I eat salad. What I kind of my internal picture of this is that if you say that if you say the topic isn't a big thing, then every other truth, like it means that I'm also imagining that fee or not fee. And it strikes me, I feel very hard pressed to say that everybody that has any imaginative activity whatsoever is always believing or is always imagining that every instance of the excluded middle is true. That doesn't seem like you're not imagining this, you're imagining other things. You're imagining that you have a fork. You're imagining that the salad is on a table. There's a lot of things that you're imagining, but it's not the case that I'm imagining I'm holding a pen or I'm not. I find that to be, and when you think about things like a current belief, if I currently believe right now that I'm holding the blue marker, it doesn't seem to follow that I'm currently believing every instance of exclusion. So in these cases, topic filtration is kind of a way to pare down the sort of body of things that I might be supposed to do. So I think that what we're doing when we're modeling that, we're literally, as we model this kind of case, we are taking that topic to be a semantic feature, and it's logically significant because it features in the analysis of the logic of our concern. Okay, so as I said, analytic implication, introduced by Perry, it's a logic, it's an intentional conditional, this sort of part of it where we're talking about truth in all accessible worlds. It's supposed to be an analogy with analytic judgments in the sense of Kant. So, I mean, Kant's analytic judgments aren't sort of entailments, but you can kind of see how my belief that all bachelors are unmarried is very similar to a claim, if something is a bachelor, then it is unmarried. I mean, there's sort of an entailment form of all these Kantian judgments. Okay, and Franz Bertha, I mentioned some of this, these topic-sensitive intentional modals that he worked on this ERC project. And as I said, if one engages in the act of imagining B, one also must imagine C. And I think the fact that there is a sort of topic thread component to that feels very natural. Okay, Perry motivated his system of analytic implication by, again, this very sort of nice case. I love this quote. I'm sorry, I didn't actually give you where the quote is from, but this is a Perry quote. If a system contains the assertion that 2 points determine a straight line, does the theorem necessarily follow that either 2 points determine a straight line or the moon is made of green cheese? No, or the system may contain no terms from which moon and so forth can be defined. So Perry's concern is that if I'm in a setting in which I am reasoning about geometrical things, right? That even though by disjunctive addition, I can kind of add in every disjunct in there, it doesn't seem like it's appropriate to the context itself. So things like addition in Perry's system, B implies either B or C. These things are gonna fail. These are bound to fail in Perry's stuff. Yeah, so it's not sufficient just to preserve truth, but we also have to prevent the introduction of new subject. Cool. Okay. Okay. So these sort of things kind of, I think there's a lot of compelling cases. If you think about like conceptual analysis, you don't introduce new topics when you're doing conceptual analysis. You only the concept being analyzed and only its parts come into play. Oh,
sorry, I have a small question about the previous slide. Because it seems that what you can say about addition is it's not that it fails, but merely that you are facing something that looks like a formula of the language, but in fact it is not.
oh, that C might not be in the language in this case.
Yeah. So
Yeah, so if I understand you correctly, if I can just recapitulate. So in this example,
Yeah.
my C is my green cheese, but in the language of geometry,
Yeah.
there is nothing to introduce here.
Yeah.
Okay. In the classical model theory, right? I mean, you have this thesis that like new constants are new variables, right? They are just, you know, like new constants are variables, and you have the same sort of thing for new predicates as well. So I mean, if you are doing model theory, it's like you can work in an expanded language. You expand the language all the time when you're doing model theory. And so it makes sense to say the sentence is true or false in a model, even if that model doesn't have definitions. So there's one thing to say about that. That I don't think it's just entirely syntactic. The other thing is even, I mean, I got interested in this stuff by thinking about logics of nonsense, right? When you start looking at like Halden and Beaufort and like Sylvan and Goddard on this stuff. When you see that it's like well-formed syntactically, but has no meaning at all. So I mean, in these cases, right, like, this is, I mean, it's slightly different context, but in the case of things like Beaufort's logic, you lose this sort of thing, phi proves phi or C, because C might be well-formed syntactically, but it might not denote a proposition. And so if this doesn't denote a proposition, it's infectious. Phi or C it doesn't denote a proposition. So even if B is true, this whole thing might fail. So if like Caesar is prime, if you go back to like Tarnap on this, Caesar is prime is one thing, or like he has these sort of nonsense predicates that like introduce into the language but don't have any intuitive meaning, or you go about this as like a positivist, like an empiricist criterion of truth or something like this. Like there's a lot of different avenues into that, but even when this is syntactically formed in these cases, it might not be meaningful. So I think that this Perry's motivation, he does say terms. So there's, I think, some something subtle to be said about Perry's motivations, especially if you go to his dissertation. He seems to be very syntactically formed, but it's still, he's syntactically motivated, but it's on this weird Wittgensteinian view of the world. That like, but if you want to view this as just a sort of Kantian kind of thing, if I look at the concept of bachelor, and I look for a thing like what, like I break apart the concept of bachelor, it might be the case that everything is a bachelor is in fact either a bachelor or you know, everything that is a bachelor is in fact either a bachelor or holds blue markers. But it's very difficult for me to motivate them, like as a matter of analysis. I got that from him. So yeah, you're totally right. It may be in terms, he's talking about something sort of linguistic here. Perry can't be pinned down really well on that. But yeah, but you can see my addition would be something, the kind of thing that would fail if we have these sorts of problems. Right. Okay. So standard treatment that we have in propositional languages, atomic formulas are assigned subject matters. So if I'm working in a propositional language, and I'm sticking in a propositional language, like quantification is a very tricky matter in here. So we've got our P's, our Q's, our R's, and so forth, and we build up more complex formulas. And the idea in the standard sort of treatment, and this is the Seidman treatment, even like Franz and Iboka and all of them stick with, is that there's a topic for every sentence, P, every atomic sentence. I'll tell you what the topic is in the models, And then we can recursively define the topics of things like connectives. The topic of a disjunction is the fusion. There's going to be a fusion operator of the topics of the parts. The topic of a negation in most of the standard things is just the topic of the things being negated. And the thing I really take issue with is already slightly larger here, is that the topic of a conditional is just the same as the topic of the parts that are fused together. So, but that fusion, I mean, like the subject matter, like if B is about dogs and C is about cats, then you have these two subject matters, dogs and cats, and you can kind of fuse them together into one subject. That's the thing that we talk about when we talk about dogs and cats at the same time, right? So there's a sort of Mariological analysis of, I can make some space. There's a sort of Mariology of topics. Like if I talk about one thing and I talk about another, I can fuse them into a complex topic that sort of gets all those things together. I said, this is about cats, this is about dogs, then the topic of anything is a cat, it's a dog, or, that is just the topic of cats and dogs. This is something I want to take issue with. I think there's a lot of empirical, like, sort of linguistic evidence to suggest that this is not a good assumption to make. So subject matter is compositional, we can compose it by this fusion, and it propagates to assign topics to complex problems. Okay, so as I said, almost all implementations, so the finishing condition for the topic inclusion is that the atoms appearing in phi appear in C. But there are clearly these sort of topic theoretic contributions that intentional connectives and I think negation, we're not going to touch it too much today, play in the determination of overall topic. Disjunction is sort of topic theoretically inert. If I'm talking about the proposition like I own a dog and I own a cat or something, like it seems like I am talking about cats and dogs. Like the fusion in the extensional connectives seems to me to be pretty plausible. You just take these topics and you push them together. When we're talking about conditionals, I think the conditional plays a role in determining the overall topic. And so I think there's a great deal of cases to show this. The case so in any intentional connectives, I mean, part of it, there's a lot of things that distinguish between extensional and intentional connectives. But I mean, one thing that I think is very obvious is that intentional connectives contribute to the determination of the subject matter level. So, like, Franz uses an example in the case of binary modals. I'll put this in the, I won't talk about this. But if you were to take this sort of topic transparency and you were to take this position that where box is like a modal box, the topic of phi is always equal to the topic, the topic of box phi is always the same as the topic of phi, then you'd be committed to saying, like, it is known that Mary loves Doug. That this is the same topic as Mary loves Doug. And I mean, we can debate whether maybe the topic of this, maybe the topic of this is contained in the topic. Maybe they're incommensurate. I mean, there's a lot of different possibilities here. What I think is really clear is that it's not the same topic. At the very least, saying it's known that Mary loves Doug introduces some kind of new topical content. I'm talking about something different. We're talking about this proposition, not just Mary and Doug and this loving that occurs. I'm not talking about that proposition itself, right? So I think that there's clearly a difference between these things. A legacy reading of like justified true belief. So we can also start looking at like the subject matter relationships that hold between different intentional operators. So on the traditional reading of knowledge that is not necessarily like an accepted view, but like is one that we're familiar with, that knowledge is just justified true belief. Knowledge of something entails both belief and also includes it as a topic, right? So if I know that by the analysis of this, part of what it means to know something is that I believe it. There's this sort of clear topic inclusion that's going on here. Part of my, again, you have to accept JTB for this to work as a definition, but part of what it means to know something, literally part, again, analysis, part of what it means to know something is to believe it. Then on this case, part of the belief is going to be part of the subject of the knowledge statement. So there's a lot of, I think, we can go in a lot of different fields and see that they're kind of nice connectors here. So if we go back to the sort of Kantian thing, that A knows P analytically entails that, that alpha knows P sort of seems to analytically entail that alpha believes P as part of the meaning, like the content of the sentence itself. Because what it means to know is to believe. So in the same way that there's a sort of Kantian, what the alpha is a bachelor sort of analytically implies that alpha is a merit. It's like a definition. It's not just truth preservation. I mean, there is truth preservation here, but it's truth preservation in virtue of a definition. And that's something that's stronger, it's something that's meaningful, and it's something that we can model. But, right, if we had just all unitary modals, if we had this kind of thing that the topic of K, if B is equal to the topic of B, if B is equal to the topic of phi, then we wouldn't be able to make sense of this kind of thing. We wouldn't be able to say, well, part of the meaning itself of knowledge and belief, because it just collapses. So what we have, I think, in natural language, we have a lot of interest in formal semantics, we have a lot of interest in having systems that give us nice accounts of the contributions that intentional operators make on the overall subject matter of the complex. So it's just tracking atoms, as is frequently done, is insufficient, and having a theory that gives us sort of an intentional account of subject matter, this is kind of necessary if we're going to build things up to be a little bit more felicitous. So what we're going to talk about is primarily linked to PA, but part of the upshot of this was I started working on this when Franz hired me for his project. And really the end goal was not just this sort of, I mean, I won't say archaic, but this kind of dated parity view. It equally applies well to this sort of new topic sensitive intentional modal style. So you can immediately, and in the second paper, it's sort of plugged in that you can start giving these nice kind of Berdo stuff using the technology that comes into play in the parity context. Okay, a lot of axioms, you don't have to look at the axioms, but there are these sort of axiomatic systems. I guess we can kind of say some things about it because some of these constraints I think are questionable. Some of these are very natural, like phi and psi analytically implies psi and phi. Like not only is it the case that anytime phi and psi is true, psi and phi must also follow, but it means that the subject matter of this is included in the subject matter of that. And again, I don't find that to be all that objectionable. When you look at some of the other parity things, though, some of these conditions start becoming a little bit more interesting. So, like if you look at A11, right? If A analytically entails C, so if all bachelors, if you know, like Sam is a bachelor means Sam is unmarried. As a matter of conceptual analysis, says A11, it has the material if Sam is a bachelor, then Sam is unmarried. I don't doubt that every time that this is true, that as a matter of like Kantian analytic judgments, phi entails psi, that phi also just materially implies psi. I don't think that that's necessarily a problem. But this also means that there's a subject matter inclusion relation. That the subject matter of this needs to be included in the subject matter of that. And that's not obvious to me. One thing to point out here is with these sort of, especially in the 70s and 80s, there's often a technique where you have like schematic formulas. So this F is any formula in which phi appears. So like what A12 says is that phi and psi are analytically equivalent, that they mean the same thing, and some sentence that includes phi, together those things analytically imply any other sentence in which you substitute psi. So again, this is a stronger condition than just like that you can substitute. It means that the meaning of the sentence is included in the meaning of the conjunction of those two sentences. So I don't want to push on this very heavily because I think the model theory is absurd. Clear so far? Okay. Okay, so the model theory that Kit Fine introduced in the 80s for parity system is essentially the sort of it's like S4 plus. S4 plus plus. you've got an underlying S4 Kirby frame. People work with modal logics, right? I've got this reflexive and transitive collection of worlds. So you can view them as like these worlds that sort of branch out into new worlds. So a world sees another world. There's a binary accessibility relation here that allows worlds to see other worlds. If you're like intuitionists, you're not intuitionists, but if you read this sort of on an intuitionistic line, it means like if you move forward in time of investigation, right? This is a future state of the investigation, perhaps. But you can do these also with different. Each world, so you've got a set of worlds, you've got this relation that's S4, so it's reflexive and transitive that holds between them. For each world, there is a semi-lattice of topics. So by semi-lattice, this is just a structure that anytime I've got A and B in this set of topics, then there is a fusion of these topics, A fusion B. And so everything is really necessary. And like I said, when I have any two things in T, that the fusion, that I can push them together to form something new. I've got evaluation for the atoms. I tell you which worlds this is true at. P is true here, here, and here. Q is true here and here. I point to which worlds the atomic sentences are true. And then I also give you an assignment at each world so that the topic of that sentence of the world is determined. So each of these has its own set of topics. P's topic is going to be determined by this TWP at this point. And we have to have some kind of reservation thing. So there's a constraint in here that if the topic of P is part of the topic of Q at some world here, and I go forward in the model, then the topic of P continues to be part of the topic of Q. So this kind of you can't just change subject when you move to a new state, essentially. The subject matter inclusion relations they're going to have to persist as I move forward through time, through the investigation, through whatever interpretation of the cryptic frame you want to do. It's clear?
Sorry, I don't understand. Can you repeat us? Okay, the topic of P is part of the topic of Q in some word.
Yes.
Then what happens? I don't know.
Okay, so if I've got it, I'm sorry, so yes, if W sees W prime.
Yeah.
So I'm here, I'm W. If I'm W here, and I'm W prime over here. And at this world, the topic of Q is part of the topic of P, or I guess vice versa.
Yes.
So if cats, the topic of like Q is like I own a cat, P is I own cats and dogs, right? That's the same.
Yes.
The fact that cats are part of the topic of cats and dogs here means that whenever I keep moving forward, that at W prime, the topic of Q continues to be part of the topic of P.
Yeah.
Right? And we need that because again, it's like we don't want to start changing subjects. Once you've committed to a certain topic through a conclusion, and I move forward in the model, I'm committed to the same conclusions. They don't have to be the same. Right? I could be here and you can have this very subtle structure, and then over here, all topics could be the same. But it's just to be preserved that inclusion relation to run forward.
Yes. Yeah.
Right? Does that answer it? Okay.
Thank
Awesome. So this is the standard thing that we kind of inherit from Git. And all of these, we're used to, if we do modal logic, we're used to being able to recursively extend the notion of truth at the world from V to truth conditions for every sentence. But we also are able to give new topic assignment things for every sentence, given the initial assignment. So as I put on there, there's assumption, this is the position known as negation transparency, that negation is topic transparent. The topic of a negation is the same as the topic of the thing being negated. And then for any binary connected whatsoever, whether it's disjunction, conjunction, or the conditional, on the Perry semantics, the topic of the complex is just a fusion of the topics of the symbols, just pushed together. And truth in the world, then truth in the world of P is true if it's an initial evaluation, and then these are very, very natural, right? A negation holds if the thing being negated fails. conjunctions hold, if each conjunct holds, same thing for disjunction, essentially. And then we've got again this sort of bipartite, what roughly called a double-barreled analysis of this analytic implication connected. So for a sentence for phi implies T to be true, it means that in every accessible world, everywhere I go, if I find phi to be true, C will also be true. So that's the first clause. When I move forward in time, anytime phi is true, C is also going to be true there. And also at that world, the topic of C is included in the topic of phi. So yeah,
That conditional and if like that.
Yes.
That conditional is a material condition.
is what kind of
Is a material conditional.
strict conditional.
Okay.
Yeah, so like the Lewis style stuff with the strict conditionals that Roy talked about yesterday, this is exactly, it's the strict conditional in the Lewis sense. Wherever you go, if you can see it and phi's true, C has to be true. So it's not just the material conditional, it's the sort of modalized strict conditional in the CI Lewis style, paired with this topic inclusion.
You mean the
English, the if, then.
Oh, yes, that English. Yeah, I think I'm fine with using it in the material conditional in the meta theory. Yeah, everywhere you go, either each fails or C holds. Yeah, so that's totally fine. Yeah, yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah, I understand what you're saying. Yeah, this is just, if then the standard materials, I could have written it either phi fails at C or
Yes, so that.
Quick question, because I mean, another way of looking at that is it's just the intuitionistic conditional, right?
just,
Which makes me wonder why you don't have an intuition, just out of curiosity about what difference it would make, why you don't have an intuitionist negation. Or some an analog of an intuitionist negation.
okay, all right, so, one is Kit's project, and they did the semantics were just, so Perry introduced these things in a couple of papers. Actually, Perry's very proud of it. If you go to the collected Gödel stuff, Gödel has remarks about Perry's system, and Perry's very proud of this. Everyone should be, right? There's like a 4-paragraph or 4-sentence like discussion of due to Gödel, like it's put in the knockoffs there. And then Urquhart and Mike Dunn go and treat these things semantically that are similar, but they don't really pinpoint Perry's system. And then Kit gives something for the system that Perry intended. It's not what Perry wrote, but it's what Perry meant, and he acknowledged as much and related. So his goal there is this project of like, you've got an axiom system, let's see how to analyze it semantically. You can do it intuitionistically, and that second grist paper, it's iterative. It starts off with Perry, and then it says, well, what if we do Perry intuitionistically? And it does this, and then it goes on and adds these sort of additional grist-like things on top of it. But so you can do it, and I think I'm the only person who put in an intuitionistic version of this. Why isn't it done, other than just the fact that Perry didn't do it? I can say any principled reason why it should not be done. I mean, I guess you could probably ask the same thing about why didn't Perry do it? It's probably the exact same reason the CI Lewis didn't do it for that explanation.
I mean, in a sense, you've got it, right? As long as you've got a falsity constant in the system, you can just use the conditional, you get a separate second defined negation and just did the intuitionistic one.
Yeah.
A Perry style intuitionist one.
Yeah, so you can totally do
The second topic.
Which actually, there are a lot of interesting things there, though. When you start thinking about containment and the contributions of it. So I gave a talk about stuff at Logika, I think the penultimate Logika. And I was like, well, look, intentional connectives don't. So one of the, I don't get ahead of myself, but one of the, I think, counterexamples that you can give to this sort of topic transparency of intentional connectives is the intuition is conditional. Like, I think there's a really clear natural language case that if I have an intuitionistic conditional, that this is not the same as just a fusion of the things that make up the thing, right? Because what does this say? This says I have a proof of P. This is this is about a proof of P. This is about a proof of P. This is about a proof of C. This is about something far more than just a proof of P. This is about this F that can go and it's this machine that takes these things and turn. This is about the topic of this is far greater than the topic of
The traditional intuition is reading, yeah.
yeah. And Heinrichs was like, well, okay, but in that case, like disjunction. I mean, like the topic of a disjunction is because when I give the topic of an intuition is a disjunction on the like BHK kind of reading is about more than just these. It's about this this selection. I have this function that I can go and tell you which one. So it gets really interesting when you think about like kind of BHK stuff and topic. So there's every reason to do that. Why didn't Harry do it? The same reason that Lewis didn't do it, because it just wasn't in their remit. Yeah, the answer?
Yeah, totally.
Cool. Okay. Oh my gosh. Sorry, I'm going slowly. I apologize. Okay. Let's actually talk about some problems with PAI. So there's a number, so like if you take conditions like the identity between these things, you can break this down. So let me first, the idea I know of fusing two topics together into a complex topic. I know that's informal, but does it kind of make sense? Like I'm having a conversation about one thing, you're having a conversation of another. We merge these two conversations, we're talking about this larger subject matter that fuse the two things together. That's all it's meant. Does it make sense? Kind of? Like, okay. I mean, I know it's a little informal, but at least we can make sense of it. Okay. So if I take this, I'm focusing on the conditional in these papers primarily, but if we take this identity, the topic of an intentional conditional is just the sum of the parts of the things of the antecedent consequent. We can break this down into some kind of subcases, and one of these is the condition of explicativity. Yeah, which is that the topic of a conditional is always part of the fusion of the topics of the antecedent consequent. So if you go along like the Perry-Fine-style line, and if you go even with Paradose line, this is going to be a consequence of that. But what's a counterexample? I said I find this to be very natural. The fact that this should be at least part, this should be the conditional topic should be part of the fusions. The PhD reading, I think, just definitively says that. Like, listen, for this, you can't globally say that this holds for all intentional conditionals because they're really counterexamples. So just assuming this out of the gate is probably way too strong. So the topic theory of intuitionist connectives can't be accounted for on this sort of coarse assumption of intentional transparency. Okay, another side of that then is this principle of ampliativity, that the topic of conditional at least exceeds that of the topic list. And this is Kit in the semantics for this considers a modification of various system in which when I talk about this like B implies C, what I'm talking about on Kit's sort of, he has a footnote or something about this, is I'm talking about B and C and implication. So there's just this implication topic that you just fuse into there. So the topic of implication itself. So that's kind of like one of these sort of principles is that like, if I'm talking about if B then C, I'm talking about B and I'm talking about C. Maybe I'm talking about a little bit more, maybe I'm being ampliative, but I can't omit anything, which seems like a taller order. And I think that in these cases, the way that I have found that you can kind of cook up counterexamples is by thinking about counterfactuals. So take these two sentences. One, okay. So I'm being like from the United States, like we think that Franklin is a person that invented bifocals. I don't know that that's actually true. We just like to say that Franklin invented everything to the point that like my kids both independently came up to me and said that when they were like in kindergarten and said that, did you know that Franklin invented electricity, right? Like everything's attributed to Benjamin Franklin. I know children, he did not invent electricity. It's better at least he didn't say that he invented lightning. So that's better than but there's also a French optometrist named Jacques Fresnel. Do you know that name named Jacques Fresnel? If you look at lighthouses, there's a thing called a Fresnel lens, which is like this, it's a lens, all these concentric circles that are, it's how like you have this big thing of light and you're able to beam it into like a small thing because each circle like keeps on moving the light closer and closer to one point. It's really cool. So Fresnel actually, I think individuals like VR. I think that the VR goggles, I think the Facebook one, I think that has a Fresnel lens in it. In order to like restrict your field of view to make a small thing look like it's bigger. Okay, but Jacques Fresnel was a famous optometrist, and he could have invented bifocals, maybe. I mean, like it's not totally nuts to say this. So one thing that we could say is this first sentence: the inventor of bifocals was a child of Jacques Fresnel. I would say that this is a falsehood about Benjamin Franklin, right? Benjamin Franklin, being the inventor of bifocals, is the referent of this, is something that this is about, and we are attributing something false to Benjamin Franklin. So I would like to say that one part of the subject matter of that is Benjamin Franklin himself. Right? The inventor of bifocals was awesome. I'm talking about Franklin. The inventor of bifocals is on the $100 bill. I'm talking about Franklin. The inventor of bifocals was a bird. I'm falsely talking about Benjamin Franklin. But it seems I'm really I'm certainly talking about Franklin as part of the subject matter. And this might be a little. I've been challenged on this before, but take the second sentence here. Had the inventor of bifocals been the child of Jacques Fresnel? So suppose that the inventor of bifocals was the child of Jacques Fresnel, then their invention would be hailed as a feat of French engineering. When we one of the traditional analyses of counterfactual conditionals is that the way that I evaluate this is I go to worlds at which the inventor of bifocals was the child of Jacques Fresnel. Right? It's also metaphysically impossible that Benjamin Franklin had been the child of Jacques Fresnel. So when I go to evaluate this on this sort of standard line, I'm thinking about worlds, and none of the reference of that counterfactual are ones in which Benjamin Franklin is the referent of my assertion. I'm only talking about things in which, Jacques Fresnel is the father of the optometrist Fresnel. But either one, right? Had the inventor of bifocals been a child of Jacques Fresnel, the antecedent, I go and I think about all these states. None of those states are ones in which Benjamin Franklin is a referent of this. And then I go ahead and I evaluate this conditional on that basis. But in this case, too, it's not about Benjamin Franklin. Benjamin Franklin does not enter into the analysis of this. My mental activity of focusing on hypothetical states in which Jacques Fresnel's kid invented bifocals, none of those things involve directing my consciousness towards Benjamin Franklin. I would like to say on metaphysical grounds that 2 is not about Benjamin Franklin. I mean, we can just. I recognize that there's a way to dispute this, but what this means is that the topic of the inventor of bifocals was a child of Jacques Fresnel is here. It contains something, Benjamin Franklin, that's not contained in the conditional. Right? And this doesn't hold, it's hold for a very specific class of conditionals, only counterfactual conditions. Right? But what that says is that I can't just assume that this holds for every conditional. As a general principle about the intentional contribution of connectives to subject matter, there are cases in which this is at the worst string. Right? And another one, and this is one thing that I like, you also get as a consequence of this, that if the topic of B implies C is just the fusion of these, and fusion is commutative, then this is the same as the topic of B implies C. So order invariance falls out of this as well. And I think this is completely knocked down. This is totally wrong. Yes.
We have only 10 minutes more, and then we will just like with the 10.
Okay. Okay. Thank you for administering math lessons. Okay. This is the interesting stuff. So, I think about tomorrow too. I did some tattoo to this. Okay, let me get the order invariance thing and then see what I had to say next. Because I think this is the, like, one of the knockdown, this is totally bad. Okay, consider two sentences then. If John were to jump from the top of the cliff, then he would injure his foot and miss the football game. And you can interpret football, it's either football or American football, depends. But if John were to jump from the top of the cliff, then he would injure his foot and miss the football game. So that's a conditional, B implies C. If John were to injure his foot and miss the football game, then he would jump from the top of the cliff. C plus B. Right? 3, I want to say, is a very anodyne sort of statement about like the fragility of the human body. Right? Like, this is a simple claim that if something jumps off a cliff, then it's going to injure itself. 2 is this kind of super shocking report about John. Like, John is so into football that if he injured his foot, like, he would throw himself off. And there is this really nice line, do I have it in here? There's this really nice line in Yellow's about his book that he considers these the sentences man bites dog and dog bites man, right? Which is like PX or PAB versus PBA. And points out like the topic of dog bites man is not an interesting enough topic to go to the front page of the news, but man bites dog is certainly something that's very curious. And Yallow's point there is that an interesting topic is different from the uninteresting topic. They can't be the same topic. That a man bites the dog is a different topic than the dog bites the man. And it's really clear to me that this is a very boring sentence about like what happens to people when they hurt themselves. This is a super shocking sentence. This is a surprising sentence about John. If one is anodyne and one is shocking, they can't be the same topic. So this has to fail. Okay, so I think that those 3 things really together kind of indicate that there's not that the theory of the sort of implicit theory of subject matter that's at the heart of Perry and that's inherited by Franz Bertho stuff is far too coarse. And that it has to be revised because the model theory has to be free from these commitments. Okay. So I just want to get through this little section and then I think I'm only like a third of the way through the slides. Sorry for that. I was just, yeah. Okay, so we've seen several sort of distinct topic features. We want to be able to accommodate things. We want to have a theory that's agnostic enough that if you want to do topic sensitive logic that's intuitionist, you're not going to have to violate the Programa principle. If you want to have a topic theoretic or topic sensitive logic that is counterfactual, you don't have to throw it out. We want to have something that can like that works with all of these different conditionals. So it doesn't make any assumptions about a conditional that lead us to violate our intuitions about other ones. So what I like to think of this is that it means that we have to remain agnostic. And what we have to have is we have to have something that T of B implies C, the topic of here, is somehow determined by these things. And I'm going to go back, I guess tomorrow, I'm going to go back and say, actually, this is not right either. But the first pass, the first solution is to say, I'm going to be sort of agnostic about this, and the only requirement I need to build in is that the topic of the conditional is a function of the topics of the parts. Right? And in a whole intuitionistic case, the topic of the whole is determined by the topic of the parts. And it seems to hold in many, many, many cases. Okay, so the proposal then is to go back. It starts off a model theory. It's model theory's first kind of proposal, and instead of just taking a topic semi-lattice at each thing, we equip for every intentional conditional that we have, and this generalizes for unary modals and things like that as well. We just add a lollipop function for each conditional that takes pairs of topics and assigns them to topics. It's a very, very, very simple sort of solution space. And then we can sort of reverse again Kit find semantics from this. But now, instead of just a topic semi-lattice at each world, we have a semi-lattice equipped with this function. And this condition that you asked about earlier about preservation, it becomes slightly more complicated. But all that means is that if I go forward in time or forward in the model, that I want to make sure that these inclusions are preserved, which means that each thing has a homomorphism, H, that preserves topic inclusion from unrolled things. And it's, if you can go to the canonical model, it's very, I don't know, the word homomorphism might be a little intimidating, but these are really easy to cook up. They're not anything complex. It's actually a pretty natural construct. And then how do we revise? We take assignment functions. We keep this in, even though I don't like it very much. But now what we do is we say, okay, when I have an intentional conditional, because again, I'm thinking about modifying parity system as a first pass. Now we take this lollipop function, and it allows us to determine what the topic of the overall conditional is. So it remains compositional. Topic is compositional in this case, but we now have more freedom to do things. And there's an axiomatization of it. The axiomatization requires that we include one little device that we have to have a notion of a formula that includes phi in the, that it appears in the right way. So, and this is very related to like what Shay and I are doing, like phi, what we're essentially resisting right here, other here. We're resisting that the topic of phi in situ, like in just as an item, that this is different than the topic of like phi implies phi. Like the topic of phi in the conditional is different than the topic of the phi in isolation. So we have to make sure that we have a schema for having formulas where phi appears in the right way. But what the upshot that we see in all these cases is this is almost directly modified by taking parity system and taking all this line. You've got these daggers here. What does parity have for A7? Well, it's an analytic implication. Well, by moving it in the way that I suggested, now it's a horseshoe. Parity said this is an analytic implication. And the way that I just suggested, that becomes a horseshoe. Same thing for all of these. You've got these horseshoes, horseshoes, horseshoes. Again, what I mentioned about the ALI thing. If A analytically implies C, it does actually follow that B implies C from a material perspective, but it's not part of the topic anymore. Right? So essentially, like all the axioms just involve us weakening the parity stuff, so that instead of that analytic implication, we just reduce it back to truth preservation alone. Okay, and all right, so let me conclude on.
Take 20 minutes for review.
Okay.
No, podemos continuar con esta biblioteca.
Okay, let's I'm sure that we talk about things that we might go to things that we don't say. I'll stop after reflecting on what this is, right? So the benefits of this sort of, and in this system, I introduce this conditional agnostic. Okay, what are the benefits or the upshots of this is that we don't violate sort of compositionality of topic. The lollipop function is weak. It doesn't screw up everything. Like things still work almost the way that they always did. It's just that we walk back what the criteria were for saying something's analytically an analytic implication. And it can be strengthened by adding additional semantic conditions. So one of the nice things about this is that if you think on these systems, if you think that, look, this sort of hypothetical syllogism thing, like listen, really, if like the sentence that B implies C and C analytically implies C, this really does analytically imply. This does analytically imply that C analytically implies C. So it's sort of if you believe that, then you can have CA PA plus A7, and that turns a new logic with a new molecule. There's a semantic constraint about this that you make on a lollipop. If you like this one, you can take this one, you can add it back in and introduce an extension that's intermediate between this system and PA, and has a semantic constraint that gets at that. Same thing for this. So all of these things that you have this sort of lattice of logics that you slowly can go and reintroduce these axioms, and each of these has a corresponding model theory, which essentially corresponds to a theory of intentional topic. Right? So we can go and take each of these things and they're, with like, for example, this, that the analytic entailment from phi to C analytically implies that if B then C. This is just the condition that the topic of B fused with the topic of C is always a part of the topic of the conditional. So there's a very natural semantic constraint right here, which is just, like, I'm sorry, if we wanted to do this more properly, we would say that the fusion of the subtopics is always going to be part of the fusion of that lollipop between them. Right? So we can start lining up very natural sort of model theoretic constraints with each of the Perry axioms and slowly sort of reintroducing. So do I think that like this conditional agnosticism is right? I don't think it's right. I don't think Perry was right. And I think that like all of Rowley's criticism is probably totally correct. But what it demonstrates is that you can go and revise a topic theoretic machinery in such a way as to start handling this. And then you can go and you can start taking things that I think are more right, like Franz Berger's systems, and you can start popping in these functions. And now you've got this really nice tool that I never had when like I mean, yeah, if you think about like think about what this means and that like I mentioned, or think about a current belief, right? If I currently believe that B, then I currently believe that I currently believe. All right, I'm sorry. My current belief of B, part of that is a current belief that my current belief of B means that I have a current belief of B. This seems, if I can just have a belief in like, I love lollipops, or I love ice cream. My current belief of loving ice cream doesn't mean that, oh, I have this current belief, I have the current belief that I love ice cream, that I love ice cream. This is like a very complicated, baroque thing, but because the topic in these systems, the topic of this is the same as the topic of this, then this has to fall. So this is an apparatus that you can go back and plug in to those that like all of these topic sensitive intentional models, and now you're not beholden to this. And like the last set of slides that I could have shown, start showing how you can actually go and do this, and you can get much more felicitous sort of accounts of the current belief, of new ability relevant information, of imaginative activity and everything. But it's just run through the Perry gauntlet first. And I take the fact that all of these things work really well, but each of these things corresponds to a nice top, like a model theoretic constraint in there. I take that as being kind of a proof of concept. Yeah, so I am actually over time. Oh, I'm going to go with these things for free.
I think it would be better if they will continue until 2 o'clock. If someone
And then,
has a question, just raise your hand.
what time is it? Okay, so time. So we'll continue. Okay, any questions? Okay, so things you get for free from here in the Perry context. If C and D, if they have the same topic, we can substitute in one in for another. So we get the following sort of things for free. So we have things like I can just start packing in antecedents. So that phi analytically implies C, analytic implies any arbitrary conjunction of these things implies C. Right. I can commute things in the consequent. I can apply things into Morgan's because these operations are sort of topic theoretically preserving in a sense. Right. So I can start doing those things. So it's not totally empty. We can get a lot of things out of it for free. Okay. So I had mentioned in that thing that probably earlier remarks that this assumed only that the topic of a conditional is a function of the topics of its clause. Okay. And I assumed that in the first 2 papers, and in the third one, I started thinking that maybe there's a lot of reasons to think that this isn't the case as well. So the third and fourth papers in the sequence go and reconsider what it means, or like whether it's an appropriate assumption that the topic of the conditional is actually a function of the topics of the parts. And this isn't to say it's not deterministic, but it's to say that other things play a role. So it seems the subject matter of this is determined by the subject matters of these, how it's left determined is left open. The principle that you have in this CAPI system, the assumption is that topic of a complex is determined by the topic subcomponents. And I started calling this principle of topic sufficiency. The topic of a conditional is always determined by these things. But going back to counterfactual conditionals, and not things that are so baroque, we have to think about like reference for indefinite descriptions, or for definite descriptions. For very obvious reasons, counterfactual conditionals start suggesting that the topic of a complex isn't always determined by the topics of its subcomplex. Yeah, so again, I mentioned negation transparency. I don't like it. I think the topic of a negation can be different than the topic of the thing being negated. But I haven't pushed on it at all. It's like a different project, and it opens up another can of worms. So we're going to assume it. I mean, I think for Nelsonian grounds, actually, Luis, I have always thought everybody frets about why can't I substitute stuff. Like I mentioned to you, like Dave Ripley and I were shouting at you about like he hates Nelson stuff because you should be able to substitute these things in any context, and you can't. I think there's a topic thread in this solution. Like, why can't you substitute? Because this is about conditions. This is about conjunctions. Like, they're true theoretically equivalent, but they mean different things. And so why would you expect them to be substituted? Right? So I think that negation transparency is, and then also, I mean, I think that this also suggests that the topic of B implies of C can often be different than the topic of. This says nothing about a counterexample. This is talking about counterexamples. This is talking about functions. I think there's like a lot of Nelsonian reasons to reject negation transparency, but I'm not rejecting negation transparency and anything at all. I'm bringing it up because we're gonna use that term. Just that the topic of a sentence and its negation of a sentence. It's a principle right there that we're gonna assume, even though it's gonna be an uncomfortable assumption. Okay. So let's think about this idea that the topics are sufficient to pin down the topic of the whole. Essentially, this says all I need to know is what kind of conditional is it, and what are the topics of my parts, and now I can determine what the whole is. Okay, so counterfactuals. Consider a conversation in which a family is planning for contingencies. So the family is, I don't know, family meeting. We're worried about John is a person that brings in a lot of money into our household. We're concerned that John's going to get laid off from his job. So we need to discuss. So I've introduced a particular conversation, and you can think about what kinds of responses one might get to this question, right? What will we do if John gets laid off from his job? One person might say, well, listen, if John gets laid off, we're going to have to postpone our vacation, right? This seems like a perfectly reasonable response. Like if I'm trying to plan my household finances and we're not going to have a lot of money coming in, and you say, well, listen, one way, if John gets laid off, we can save some money by postponing our vacation. I think that it's a totally reasonable comment to make in that context. But what about this context? Well, if John does not get laid off, we're going to postpone our vacation. If I say, like, we need to save money, John's going to get laid off from his job, I'm worried about this, how are we going to save money? And you say, well, okay, what if John doesn't get laid off, then we'll postpone our vacation. Like you're missing the whole point of the conversation. The point of the conversation is we need to worry about these contingencies in which John gets laid off. Why are you talking about this? That's not part of the presupposition of the whole conversation itself. And the green did not. Good. I'll write this in green on this. Okay. On topic. This feels in this conversation that this is on topic. Like I have not deviated from the subject matter of my conversation. This is off topic. I'd like to say that if I start a conversation, like we need to consider the contingencies in which John gets laid off his job, and you say, well, let's talk about the contingencies. Let's talk about the contingencies in which he does not get laid off. Like you've veered off topic of the conversation. And yes, I understand how the conversation's subject matter gets introduced is a pragmatic thing. I understand that there's like a presupposition that goes into this. The point is not whether it is whether they match, whether it's the subject matter of the conversation is laid out pragmatically, or whether it's a semantic object. The point is that these can't mean the same thing. They can't have the same topic. You can't have something be on topic in one context and off topic in the same context and have them mean the same. So I think this sort of, and again, there's a lot of like conversational and pragmatic issues go in there, but I think the point stands that these things are made of the same thing. This is if B, then C. This is if not B, then C. The topic of B and C are the same. So if it's a function, actually, well, already, let's write it up. Okay, so the topic of B is the same as the topic of not B, per negation transparency. If we take the topic's efficiency thing, then the topic of B implies C is equal to some F of the topics of B and the topic of C. But by substituting because it's identical, this is the same as some F of the topic of not C, topic of C, B and C. And this is equal to the topic of not B plus C.
Yes.
Make sense?
Yes.
If this can be off topic while this is on topic, they can't be the same topic, and therefore, like something in here is gotta give. It can't just be determined. Okay. So then what can we possibly do about this? But in our sort of reason I can explain the difference of the topic is the first one talks about the right contingencies. Like when I introduce it on a counterfactual conditional, part of it, whether it's a pragmatic act or it's a linguistic act or whatever, is I indicate that there's a certain set of contingencies that I'm talking about. When I say, hey, if John gets laid off, we're gonna postpone our vacation, what I'm saying, subject matter wise, is hey, there are these cases in which John gets laid off. Let's talk about them. And also in these cases, we postpone our vacation. Like, let's talk about these contingencies, right? So the first talks about the right contingencies, and the second talks about the irrelevance of contingencies. And I think that about is necessarily right. This is about something different. This is about cases in which John does not get laid off, and something more, perhaps. This is about cases in which John does get laid off, and something. They're literally, I think, about different things. And that's because part of the subject matter when we're thinking about counterfactual conditionals is those states about which I speak. Like that, whether I hypothesize them, whether they're in some concrete way, I'm talking about something that I'm not talking about in the other case. As the consequences are identical, the set of situations, one is determined by the truth conditions of the antecedent in these cases. And this coheres with like the restrictor view of counterfactual conditionals. So in this sort of reading, like the way the conditionals work is I restrict to a set of states that's determined by the antecedent. And I want to say that it seems very plausible to me that when we do that restriction, that those states make up part of the subject matter of the whole. And that's something that's totally omitted in the standard system that's in the Bill studies and the JBL. One thing that's interesting here, though, and actually I got called on this at the penultimate Logika by Nick Ferrans. I gave this sort of thing, and I was like, well, clearly, I was just holding the Kratzer here. I was like, well, how do we want to determine what the subject matter is? My first pass at this before I finished everything was we've got three things that play a role in here. We've got the subject of the antecedent, which is the same as the subject of the antecedents here. The subject of the consequent, subject same as the consequent, subject of the consequent here. But then also those states that these restrict. And the states that B is about are different than the states that not B is about. So it's a function of three things I wanted to say. It's about the topic of the antecedent, the topic of the consequent, and the truth set of the consequent. And so these are different arguments, right? Because this truth set and the antecedent is different. It's the complement of the truth set of the second. Does that make sense? The worlds in which John gets laid off are different than the worlds in which John is not. And that forms an argument intuitively of how I assign subject matter to a complex when I'm thinking about counterfactual conditions. So I gave this sort of the first pass when I presented this. like a year and a few months ago, I said, okay, well, the way that we need to revise is that CAPAI says it's a binary function between two subject matters. I said, well, okay, what we need is the subject matters of the consequent, the subject matters of the antecedents, and also the set of worlds in which the antecedents true. It needs to be a ternary function. And Nick Rentz is like, you're dumb. And he was like, haven't you ever read like this footnote in Ed Mayer's book? And I was like, oh, I read the book and I don't remember the footnote. He's like, yeah, because it goes back to this Dumb Goodbye thing. Dumb Goodbye had this nice case in which it's not always the antecedents. There are a lot of cases in which the consequence also played that sort of restricting role. So Goodbye gave these two sentences, right? If I were the Pope, I would have allowed the use of the pill in India, versus if I were the Pope, I would have dressed more humbly. And Goodbye's point is that these things are determined, the sort of set of worlds that these are about are determined in these cases by the consequence as well. So the fact that this is not a far stretch for the Pope to be dressing more humbly, like this, the set of worlds over which you evaluate this isn't all that dissimilar, despite the fact that they have identical antecedents. Allowing the Pope going and saying, I'm going to allow the use of the pill in India when he's the Pope, that's a very remote thing. So like the consequent in this plays that restricted class. Now we have to think about more remote possibilities to happen. So Doug's point here, Doug Goodbye's point here is that it's not just the antecedents. It's not just we need to know the set of worlds in which the antecedent is true. We need to also think about the consequence here. So to get this, clearly, Goodbye writes, clearly in the first statement, we must assume that India, the assumptions that we have to make about those things, we have to assume that India remains overpopulated and poor in resources. In the second, no other assumptions are really necessary. So the consequence can play a role in determining the set of worlds that a conditional is about, just as easily as the form. Right, as the concept. I'm sorry, just as easily as the antecedent. And we can make this in more, I think, natural terms by thinking about another topic. So that what do we do if John gets laid off? Those things are on different topics because we had fixed the set of topics that are acceptable for the conversation based on like future planning. So we're really thinking about the antecedents in these cases. But there's a lot of cases in which we're doing sort of backwards reasoning. We're doing like sort of abductive reasoning about what could possibly explain something. And in these cases, when we use conditionals, the consequence play a greater role. So if I start a conversation by asking why Amir was laid off, I don't know why I was concerned about layoffs here. I don't know. Maybe I was very worried about employment at this point, which is natural. Why was Amir laid off from job? I invite you all to come and talk to me about investigating why Amir was laid off from his job. And you can imagine a couple of things. Well, let's think about why Amir was laid off. One person could say if the new products had failed to go to market, then export would have been forced to have layoffs. So suppose that Amir worked for export. This seems like a reasonable sort of abductive hypothesis. Well, like maybe if you want to think about what would have caused there to have been layoffs, we can look back and see that maybe there have been new products that didn't actually launch. The second thing that somebody could say is, well, if the new product had failed to go to market, same antecedent, export would have not have had layoffs. And I want to say that for similar reasons, on topic. The first one is on topic. I want to find out why Amir got laid off. This seems like a reasonable thing to introduce into the discourse. This one, it's only drawing conclusions about what would happen. There are no cases. And this is off topic. Because what is this talking about? This is talking about explanation for those contingencies in which export had laid off Amir. This one is talking about contingencies in which export did not have. This is the right one. This is on topic for the pursuits of the conversation. This is not. And what that means, you can't have this. Something has the same topic cannot be both on topic and off topic. That's it. So they have to have different topics. And since they have the same antecedents, it can't just be like my topic of B implies C, the first thing I proposed was that this is a function of the topic of B, the topic of C, and like the set of worlds at which B is true. The topic of B and the topic of C and the set of worlds in which the antecedent is true is the same in this case. So this can't be sufficient. Rather, we need to also look at the set of worlds in which the antecedent or the consequence. Sorry. So it needs to be a quaternary thing. And it can be reduced down by thinking about it can be sort of, I don't like quaternary functions as semantic primitives. So it can be pared down back to a binary thing by taking what Franz Werdo and some of his collaborators have called a two-component semantics, right? So two-component semantics, it allows all kind of important connections between truth conditions and topics. According to 2C, two-component semantics, facts about either cannot be reduced to facts about the other in the sense described above. So, so in models of topic, in this sort of revised thing, we follow sort of 2C, this two-component intuition. So we don't think about truth conditions, we don't think about topic conditions, we think about contents as pairs of the sets of worlds in which something is true and also about its topic. And between those two things, then we're able to do a little bit better in terms of now thinking about a binary function again. So the 2C intuition, we've got a topic, it's paired with a truth conditional proposition, or like a UCLA proposition, and that's our basic semantic entities. Okay, so in this case, we're going to allow this sort of notation to note that truth set from the perspective of a world. So this is all of those worlds that W can see at which phi is true. So I'm at a world W, this is all of those worlds that I can see at which phi is true. And we're going to let TW be our topic assignment function as before. Okay, so instead of having a V function, do I keep a V function? Instead of having these distinct like valuations and truth conditions, now instead we assign contents to sentences. So the content of an atom is it's just a pair of its topic and at a world, the content at a world. Its topic at that world paired with all the worlds at which that sentence is true from the perspective of them. And then we can do the things for conjunction and disjunction in a very similar way. They're extensional. I don't think that they're sort of topic theoretically influential. But in the truth conditional case, we just say cap and cup. And now in this case, what is my lollipop is going to be a function that takes pairs of contents. So it's a quaternary function in some sense. It has truth set topic, but we can collapse into a binary function by taking primitives as pairs. And then the set of sentences, a set of worlds in which the conditional is true. Okay, so how do we do this model theory? We do the model theory as follows. We've got each W, we've got a set of contents. We've got for any content, A and X, there's this homomorphism. Again, it may look a little bit wonky, but it just says that whenever I have a topic about a set of worlds, or the contribution made by a set of worlds to the overall topic at W is going to be preserved as I move forward. So like at home, if I'm up in a Kripke frame and I'm over here, and I have a set X, if I move over here, then the contribution that X made from W is going to be the same as the contribution that X makes restricted to W prime. Right. So like think about it this way. If I say like right now, I'm talking if John were laid off, we would have to rethink our vacation. I'm thinking about a set of worlds in which John gets laid off. If I say this in 10 years' time, if John gets laid off, we're going to have to rethink the vacation. Technically, I'm talking about a subset of worlds. Because John getting laid off in 2025 is no longer operable in 2034. Right, but what I want to say is that the topic from that perspective is going to be unaltered. Right, so as I move forward in time, for example, that restricted class of worlds that the counterfactual is about, that thing might start getting smaller because I'm moving forward through my Kripke model. But from the perspective of a world, that's not going to affect its overall view of the topic. That's all. Okay. And got a binary function from topic or contents to topics. And then again, the homomorphism is there to preserve these things. Again, not scary. Very similar axiomatization. We have to introduce like a kind of T device, which is phi or not phi, to get some of these things correct. And there's one axiom that I hate, but I can never get rid of for completeness. But we have a nice axiomatization. You have again in sort of daggers where you've got sort of parity style things that are just walked back in terms of their strength. And then you have some things that essentially give you substitutivity in topic threaded content. So like what T of B does, it's just phi or not phi, but because of negation transparency, all that is, it's a tautology that sort of wears the subject matter on the sleeve. So that's required for the axiomatization, but it's all nice axiomatizable. And I was saying, talking about a couple of these extensions, right? So in the same way as we can build up new logics from the conditional agnostic thing, we can do the same sort of thing. One thing that I found interesting, and I'll leave it with this, is this thing isn't true. This what I call the restrictor axiom isn't valid in the state-sensitive models, which seems to me to be kind of weird. So I think we can probably whiteboard this. If I have what this needs to be true is that the topic of B and C implies C is contained in the topic of B or C implies C. So in these two cases, the topic of the antecedents are the same. The topic of B and C is the same as the topic of B or C. The topics of the consequence are the same. The topic of C is the same as the topic of C. The topic of, the truth set, the set of worlds of which C is true, is triply the same. And here's the weird thing is that the set of worlds at which phi and C is true is a subset from the perspective of any W to the set of worlds at which the disjunction is true. So on all of those three components that kind of matter, the topics of each part are the same, the set of worlds of which the consequence are the same, and in this case, the topic of the antecedent, or the set of worlds of which it's true, the things that we'd be talking about, is a subset of the topics in here. So you would kind of expect that given the fact that everything is the same except for the set of worlds of which is the case, and you have this proper inclusion. When I'm talking about this sentence, I'm talking about a larger class of situations than this. So you would think that you would get this kind of you get this inclusion right here. But you have to enforce this with something else. This doesn't come out true. And there's a nice-ish semantic constraint on the topics that we can introduce that gets us the right class of models. And I think it's actually kind of a nice semantic constraint. So if I've got topics D and F and E and F, if the topics of the antecedents are the same, and I'm sorry. Okay, if the topics of the antecedents are the same, and the set of worlds at which D is true is a subset of the set of worlds at which E is true, then you're going to have this inclusion baked into the model. I think it's a kind of nice constraint, and it gets us something that I think is pretty nice, and that gets us an extension. So again, that kind of subtlety that we can start plugging in new things. This is a constraint of propositional non-specificity. This restrictor axiom gets us the right stuff. And we can start building all sorts of things. But I know that I've already pushed it past what we'd all planned on. So, I'll leave it with one last point. Sorry. We can just, again, identify, or we can get to CAI, the conditional agnostic thing to stop PAI, but just identifying lollipop with the function, the diffusion function. So you can do the same thing for these cases. They're very nice semantic constraints to just get you up to the next level very easily. Okay. Oh my gosh. Oh my gosh. Oh, okay. Okay, thank you very much. Sorry for taking so long. Okay.
Question?
Yes. Thank you very much for the, I have a bigger question. I do have any definition of contention in your first part? Definition of contention. Any formal definition of contention.
Intention.
The contention.
Content.
Okay. No. Yes, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Yes. Yeah. No. You could just define it out of there. If you want contents, you could define it in the same way. But you wouldn't. The thing about the contents in the latter groups of systems is that they have to talk to each other. The topics of a complex are responsive to the truth conditions of its parts, and the truth conditions of a complex are responsive to the topics of its parts. So there has to be this sort of discourse between the contents themselves. In the just the first set of cases that I suggested, the topic is entirely of a complex is entirely, it doesn't need to think about the truth conditions at all. All it needs to know is the topics of the parts. And the truth conditions, for the most connections, you don't need to know anything about the topics, right? So in the case of the contents, why it becomes important to pack them up is that the contents of a whole is determined by the contents of its parts. Actually, in the paper, I had to worry about compositionality because there's, I think a very vanilla understanding of what compositionality is with like the compositionality, like the truth conditions for a sentence should only be determined by its truth conditions. And the topic of a sentence is compositional because it only takes into account the topics of its subsentences. And I felt worried that like you could say this isn't compositional because the topics are now sensitive to the truth conditions, and the truth conditions are sensitive to topics. It's not compositional. I'm the compositional. Okay, you're just thinking about compositionality wrong. It's not compositionality of topic. It's compositionality of contents. And so you have one object, and it is functional. The content of a whole is always determined by the content of the thoughts. And so that feels to me to be more satisfactory from a compositional perspective. So that's TLD. Yes. There is a notion of content that you could define. You use 2C sort of framework in the cases, but you could also use it in classical logic, right? I mean, it's got a set of truth conditions, and everything's got the same topic. It just doesn't become as useful in that case. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you for the question. I appreciate it.
Christian?
Thank you, Thomas, for the presentation.
Thanks for your presence.
The
questions.
The topic that you have presented so far in the first part have to do with the properties of the conditionals. I would like to ask you, what problems do you have with the neutrality of topics of the negation and just negation without conditionals?
Yes.
Because I believe that I like your thesis of the negation transparency, and also applies to negation and just negation.
Yes, I don't like negation transparency. When Ron's hired me, I was like, I read this book that there was a manuscript at that point that he and everybody on the project put together. And I was like, I think everything here is great. You're wrong on two things. You're very, very wrong on two things. Like negation transparency, you were dead wrong about. You were dead wrong about like the transparency of intentional conditionals and intentional operators part of it. And he's like, great, show me that I'm wrong. And there's like 8 papers for the conditionals, right? I had to focus on one thing. Negation transparency is tricky. And part of the problem is that I have always had a difficult time articulating what I'm concerned with to my satisfaction with that. I think that there's a lot of like, I think some of the counterfactual arguments about transparency of intentional conditionals, I think those are knock down. Well, I think like you cannot, like you can't contraposition isn't topic preserving. Like not contraposition, but when I flip MC conversation. Conversing is not topic preserving. Like, I think it is totally obvious to me that those are not topic preserving. Negation, that P and not P have different topics. It requires, I can't find that knock down thing or like, this is why I just said it wrong. I'm very beholden to Nelson style things where like, if I'm going to be a hardcore Nelsonian about this, like, what is the topic of phi? This is about a proof of phi. What is the topic of not phi? It's about a refutation of phi. Like, this is about a proof. This is about a separate type of object. The refutation, maybe we can convert these things. This isn't as compelling. I tried pulling this with Franz. I was like, well, look, like if you're Nelson, like clearly this is about proofs of reputations and big different things. Like, okay, I'm not convinced. I haven't found the knockdown stuff yet on this. There is a nice example. So I'm also I'm a Richard Angel fan with this system of analytic containment, and there's an example that I like, with its P and Q and not Q. He's like, it's like this does not imply P and not P and Q. And the only way on a meaning containment thing to make sense of this, because the topics are the same, is that there's a contribution that not P is making and not Q is making that it doesn't get you where you're. And he has this like Mary weeps. He has this natural language example, but it's difficult to turn that into a very compelling argument against it. And I've always come up a little bit short. One thing I can say about this though is the following. I think I don't think I'm wrong for this. I just think I'm not smart enough to articulate it yet. One thing that I can say is that if you interpret relevant logics as having, they have this variable sharing property. That if I can prove something in a relevant logic, phi implies C, that there has to be a variable that appears in Q and appears in C. I'm sorry, Q. Phi and appears in C. So that's the VSP, right? That if I have a theorem, there has to be an atom. There is a strong VSP though, that holds for this exact same class of logics. Actually, I don't know. Are there logics that have VSP but not strong VSP? I would be shocked. Yeah. All of the mainstream relevant logics that I know of have this property that P doesn't just have to appear in phi and appear in C. It has to appear with the same sign. If it appears positively in phi, it has to appear positively in C. So it's negation, and if you think of relevance as topic overlap, then this is already saying that the contribution that phi makes when it's in a positive mode is different than the contribution that P makes in a negative. So it's already, I think, been implicit in relevant logics for 60 years. So I think you've got like one of the main fields of non-classical logics already has something that intuitively violates topic or negation transparency. So I have some examples of why I think it's suspect that I can't turn into knockdown arguments yet. And I think that there's sort of a critical mass of things that intuitively violate negation transparency that I can say like Rowley assumed it, or Sylvan assumed it, Anderson and Belknap assumed it, Mike Dunn assumes it. Everybody who does relevant logic assumes this implicitly. It can't, there has to be a good argument out there that I just haven't stumbled on. And a lot of things that say that we're doing right now is trying, I think, is motivated by this case, that a contribution to a sentence that P makes is going to, at the end of the day, be different than the contribution, the overall topic that not P makes. It's still a work in progress. I'm sorry, there's a lot of words for a small, a short question. I'm sorry, I didn't answer your question at least. Okay, thank you. That's a very good question. Appreciate it.
Luis first, then put, and then Miguel, please.
Oh, now. It's like dead man walking, you're gonna have a last drink.
It's because I have too many questions. Okay, I will try to combine two of them. It's because I can see the connective stuff appearing here, not explicitly, but some hidden form.
I want to do that.
Yeah. So my question is, when we were discussing this issue about off-topicality, were you thinking in some way about connectivity? Because these two conditionals, one with the
Like Heiner style?
not exactly, actually, pretty standard connective stuff. You know, the conditional that is on topic. Let me rephrase this. Given certain conditions, these two conditionals, one with the negative antecedent, cannot hold. That's just Abelard, some form of Abelard synthesis or something like that. Or given some conditions, this conditional, these two conditionals, one event with the consequent negated cannot hold, cannot be both on top. And I mean, that requires two sort kinds of negations, right? One for the truth, negation of truth, and the other for negation of being on top. But that discussion reminded me of connectivity in some way.
Yeah, I totally see a thread. I don't know how to follow it, where it leads exactly, but yeah, there's I think especially when we start thinking about like the truth condition strategy, the consequence, like the problem is that I mean on like these things like B entails C and B entails not C. Thank you. Oh, we're just thinking about it. No, I think we're leaving. I'm gonna say goodbye. Yeah, I totally see it. I don't know where to take it, but I initially, when you were saying this, I was thinking like the states in there like play a role in differentiating between if B then C and if B then not C in a way that you can't do in the former stuff. But I don't know if you could fork it. I don't know if like it gets weak enough that you could start putting in connective stuff on. I'm not sure. But I mean like connective stuff and contents like that those should be related in some way.
Yeah, and that's the second part of my question. Because I'm trying, when France came with all this framework, I was excited because I thought it was a good, nice framework to do something about the contentless contradictions, right? Maybe we can buy this story about the negation transparency. Phi and non-phi are about the same thing, but their conjunction has no content. But in the end, I couldn't figure it out how to
You
use
added
it.
operators on the topic semi-lattice.
Yeah. So my question was, you thought about this?
I have not, but I agree. It's you could equip new functions or something on.
Yeah.
Everything gets a topic, and we have a recursive way of assigning topics. And so if you don't know, like so CRAN has this connected logic based on the fact that contradictions have no topic, because if P and not P come together, they obliterate, they like eat each other's topics. It's content, there's no topic. And therefore it has no consequences because phi and not phi doesn't say anything. I really want that to work.
Yeah, me too, but I couldn't take it.
Well, one of the problems with that is it's almost single-minded. Like, you don't think about the negations that are like nested in them, right? You think about the most external negation in that case, and the story is really compelling on a superficial level of like, okay, I've got a sentence and got its negation. Clearly, if I can join it, like, it obliterates all the content. Like, that makes a lot of sense, but then it doesn't. Well, okay, well, what if I've got something that has, if I have P and not Q, and then P and Q, like, well, does P get left over? Like, there's all these things that, like, but if you do it completely semantically, and you have an operator to do this sort of negation and like obliteration thing, like, it seems like you would be able to go deeper into the nesting, which is something that would be cool. Right? Because the story, when you just tell it about contradictions, it seems really plausible, but then when you think about it, it's not just things that are formally P and not P, but anything that doesn't have a model. I think it's still compelling, but it's not compelling on that sort of negations cancellation. Like, the negation of cancellation interpretation is very heavily married to a particular presentation and a particular syntactic class of functions. Right? Like, I'm sorry, if I'm not being clear, like P and not P, this whole like, well, this guy eats this guy and therefore there's no content. That doesn't really explain like the lack of content in this. Right? But like this whole like P and not P come together, it's like matter and antimatter destroy each other. Like this kind of like story is like, oh well, what's the problem here? It's like P came together with this, it didn't destroy each other because this is true. But then the negation went and destroyed the fusion. It just doesn't make any sense. It's like, but if you had like topics and then you had like negations like assigned to functions and take topics to like, I don't know, maybe functions over topics. Like I can see that working in a way that would be more satisfactory. So yeah, I think it's really attractive. I don't know where to go though. We should at some point talk about it. Is there anything else on that list?
So many things, but I prefer being right on there.
Yeah, I mean, this is again going to be questions about negation.
Yeah.
So, yeah, when you were going through the examples with the on topic, off topic, and particular cases where the only difference was the presence or absence of negation. I mean, my first thought there, and given now what you said about not liking transparency, maybe eventually this is where we end up. But my thought was just, well, clearly the problem is with the presence of the negation. So we need to add a second function, right? So so that the topic of negated formula is some function of the topic of the unnegated formula. Or even simpler, going back to what I asked about sort of while you were giving the talk, is just tree negation is defined in terms of the conditional and fulsome, and then negation gets handled as a special case, right? Where the topic of negation is a function of the topic
It gets some attention.
unnegated, fulsome, and the other stuff that's needed. I'm just curious, why didn't you take that route and see what happened there?
Part of it is again pragmatic. Like I joined on Franz's project. It was like a 5-year project, and I jumped in the 5th year, right? And I, of course, wanted to do everything, but I also realized I wanted to do negation transparency. I wanted to do transparency. I wanted to solve the problem about topic assignments to quantified formulas. Which, oh my, it's actually I've got some cool thoughts on it, but it's a difficult thing. I mean, like. You've written a bit about like variable sharing with like, first order stuff. Like it becomes really, really hard to make sense of relevance between these things if you try and approach it from a like topic threading view. So I wanted to do all of these things, but I also realized that I started with 11 months, like the clock was ticking, and I wasn't going to succeed in all of the things, but maybe I can penetrate one of these things enough. So I just bit my lip and I was like, I thought for the first month, I kind of dug the bronze and was like, these are the things that I can provide knockdown arguments for that are like super philosophically plausible. And these are things that I'm uncomfortable about, but I can't convince you. If I can convince Franz, then that's a good, Franz is a difficult guy to convince. Like if I can convince him on something, it's probably a very fertile ground. And I think you could, I think that the intuitive story that's going on with those off-topic, on-topic cases is so natural that what's really the problem is that I'm talking about a different set of contingencies. That I'm not sure that even if we did that on negation, I'm not sure that you can cook up another chili cooker. I'm sure that you could cook up something that finds a way to get different sets of worlds, but still has the same. Yeah. Okay. So like not. You could probably Klevenko your way out of it, and something that these two have to have the same topics, but have different sets of worlds, or these things have the same topic. They have the same topics, but are true in different sets of worlds, and therefore, listen. The presupposition of this conversation is you're talking about these sets of worlds. You're talking about these ones, and I think that you could probably cook up some kind of example.
I did want to mention that I think actually double negation is a good counterexample to transparency. Because it just strikes me, not P is not about the P's, it's about the not P's.
Yeah, it's
and it begs the question to assume that those are the P's, right?
Yeah, I did this paper that nobody cares about in HAL on non-involutive gravity stress. Like, so Gemma Robles has written a couple of things on that with Mendez. But mine was like it was about when you know that they are going to eventually come back. They have to be, I'm sorry, I know the word. They have to come back. There's some period that they have to come back to the original world at some point. And you get those variable sharing powers. So the topic of P is different than the topic of not P, and it might be the same as not P. And nobody's ever cared about it, but it turns out that it becomes really important with like the topic throwing analysis of like BM, for example. It like pops out of that stuff. I think, yeah, the response, of course, would be like, well, they're pragmatically different, and it's always a rough one to encounter. But yeah, I should think about whether that can be resolved too. Because I guess it's maybe the thing is that, like, I think in the last thing I did on this, I think I called it involutive transparency. That like I can't accept negation transparency, but maybe involutive transparency. So if anything, like in print, I've actually said like, well, not P's. If it shows a topic of P, it's gone. I'm not as offended by that. But yeah, I should think about nesting those negations and seeing if there's something done. It's annoying. It's just like I'm thinking of an analogy. Like amazing magical thinking. Like I want it to be the case so bad that I have this thing and I just can't ever try to reach it. It's like, I don't know, like training in the gym. And you just like, you want to get to a certain weight and you just plateau right before it. It's like, I see it. I see that there are so many reasons to not accept negation transparency, but I can't ever quite articulate it. But I'm sorry, to your question, yes, I think in those particular examples, you could probably make that case, but I would be afraid it would rear its head again in some other cases as well. Thanks.
Miguel?
Thank you, Thomas. My question, I have a silly question actually. Is there any proof theoretic version of all of this? Because I think when we are working with model theoretic version to explain non-topical neutrality of connectives or operators, we introduce more machinery than what que nosotros, más maquinaria que nosotros necesitamos, more machinery than it is needed. More machinery that it is needed. So I think if we will provide a proof-theoretic version, things will be easier. But I don't know.
So, when you say proof theory, do you have a particular type of proof theory in mind?
For example, Gans and natural deduction,
Okay.
axiomatics.
Well, so these all have,
Axiomatics there.
going back into the slides. And there are, each of these has an axiom system. That's less machinery. There is a little bit of notational stuff, like you have to still use these like schema for formulas. And again, this axiom is, I'm so guilty. This is so gross. I think it's, it can be eliminated or if you're empty. But I mean, there's proof theory. What I think would be really nice is, like if you think about this in like a sequence calculus where you have to take that into consideration as well, like introducing conditional. The problem with when you do these things like who's actually made some winners. So again, I think about this stuff as very similar to like the Holland and Bocar nonsense logics. And when you do the proof theory for these, Cornelio and I think one of his former students introduced these sequence calculi for Bocar system and stuff. And they have to have all of these weird variable sharing constraints, and you can introduce the disjunction so long as you know that the atoms appearing in the disjunct, the right disjunct already appeared in one of the things on the left side of the sequence. And it's like, there's these sort of weird, icky syntactic constraints that I don't like. Some people, Francesco Paoli and a couple of his former postdoc/students have been doing this stuff instantly with ST. That doesn't require these sorts of weird, like tracking of atoms. So that suggests to me that you might be able to do something similar, but I don't know. Again, as like somebody who's like, I think I'm kind of inferentialist at heart in some ways. Like I would like to say, well, taking especially if this position holds, here's when you can introduce the analytic implication. It's just, it's not, I don't know how to do it without doing syntactic tricks. I don't know how we would do it without syntactic tricks.
Yeah.
Okay. And there's one of the things that model theory gives is it's not disgustingly syntactic, I think. Like Sullivan was really did not like Perry stuff because it's like it's all just the syntactic filter. And I think when we move on, we have this with operations, with intentional operations on these things, it becomes less and less obvious that we're supposed to go, that what was going, that what was that what was going on the whole time. Yeah. But yeah, I hope to be able to do this and stuff with these things at some point that seems like a very good task. Yeah. Yeah, thanks.
I think there are no more questions.
I think we should stop.
I'm so sorry, I think we already lunch. It's really late. Yeah, I apologize. I'm doing every time.